Om. I feel extremely delighted to welcome you all to this book unveiling event. And we have this book called Kautilyanomics for Modern Times, and it's written by Sriram Balasubramanian ji, who is here with us. So, can we have a huge round of applause for him, our guest? We also have Professor Sanjeev Kumar ji, who is the Dean of Rashtram School of Public Leadership. He will be moderating today's session. And I would like to request Sir to please felicitate our guest. Now I would request Sriram ji to present Sanjeev ji with the book and show it to all our listeners. Now I would request our esteemed guest to please come on the stage and address us, and then we will move ahead with the discussion.
Namaste to everyone. Shri Guru Pyo Namaha. It's an honor to be here at this university, and I'm glad to be, presenting my book here. Forgive me for my throat. The Delhi weather has taken its toll, I think. The three reasons why I think this book is important. Firstly, the Arthashastra has been talked about widely by many people. We talk a lot about Chanakya, we talk a lot about Chanakya Neeti. We talk a lot about the political philosophy of Chanakya. But the Arthashastra, there's a reason why it's called the Arthashastra. And it's primarily about wealth creation. And unfortunately, there are just two books on the economics of Kautilya. But when I was writing this current book, there was just one book, which focused on the economics of Kautilya. That was an academic book by Professor Balbir Sehag. For a civilization that is so proud about Kautilya and Chanakya, I think it's very important that more books are produced on his idea of economics. And that's why it took me 5 years to do this book. And I find it a moral obligation to say it here in this venue, because the kind of university that Shobit ji is trying to inculcate and develop, the idea of rishihood itself focuses on the civilizational impetus to policy making. And unless we first come to an understanding of what our past is, and in an academic sort of way, in a rigorous way, in my view, we'll never be able to move forward. I think that's what this book tries to do. It tries to bring Kautilya's ideas into within an analytical setting. It provides an analytical framework to Kautilya's ideas, and provides a lot of rigor to the ideas presented in the book. So first is acknowledgement of this, the need for civilizational understanding. Second is, now that we have a civilization understanding, what is a framework that Kautilya had? So in this book, I try to illustrate the idea of dharmic capitalism, where I showcase the idea of dharma being the central pillar of Kautilya's thinking. So today we have the state and we have the market, and much of modern economics is between these two binaries, between the state and the market. So Kautilya was of the view that the role of dharma could play a sort of self-correcting mechanism between the state and the market, and thereby a more sort of dharmic society can enable economic prosperity. So he saw the linkage between the idea of dharma, the way of life that we have, and the idea of economic prosperity. So the book tries to provide this framework, and it talks about the idea of wealth creation. It talks about the idea of sustainable growth. It also talks about the idea of a rule enforcing but non-intrusive state. These are sort of three pillars of Kautilya's dharmic capitalism. And again, the idea of dharma again has many meanings. So in this book, I sort of define dharma through prisms of ethics, responsibilities, and a sort of a broader harmony, international harmony. And these are mapped to the ideas of wealth creation through an sort of an open interaction with the world, the role of a state which is strong but doesn't intervene or micromanage activities, and the idea of sustainable growth. Kautilya is very, very focused on the idea of sustainable growth. All the issues of sustainability, climate change, environment that we talk about today was integral to his sort of worldview, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So this book tries to establish this framework. The third part of the book is, okay, so once you establish a framework, how is it relevant today? I think as policymakers, future policymakers, it's important to understand the contextual relevance. So the book tries to, in each chapter, it goes to, for example, there's a chapter on trade. It talks about trends in trade during Kautilya's time. And then it talks about trends in trade in today's times. And then it gives a Kautilyan Tantra. It's sort of an idea that Kautilya had before, and how is it relevant today. And there are many chapters on wealth creation, on sustainable growth, the role of contracts. A lot of us study the idea of minimum wage. Sanjeev spoke to me about the idea of opportunity cost. These are all ideas that Kautilya already had 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And some of this is illustrated in the book. And how some of his innovations in some of these ideas could be applied today. So he had the idea of flexible minimum wage. So the book tries to extract some of these ideas, and then in each chapter it highlights its relevance. And at the end of it, it sort of summarizes the entire framework and provides it to the reader. Lastly, I want to mention that why I think is very important for this institution is this is the sort of work that we need to produce more and more. There needs to be hundreds of books on Kautilya, challenging, debating, discussing these ideas, or even having counter ideas to this. And I think that's the primary purpose of the book. For an institution which is priding itself on the role of civilizational values, I think it's important that we take this to the next step, where not only do we highlight the relevance, but we bring a certain amount of rigor, analytical rigor, to the subject, and not just talking about flying kites or talking stuff without analysis. And I think that's why, as future policymakers, a lot of you, I hope, this sort of provides a motivation for you to look at these ideas and then probably take it and do more research on these subjects. So with this, I'd like to wrap up my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for introducing us to the book. And just let me add this, that we are really delighted and honored to have economists, renowned economists like yourselves between us. And with this, I would like to invite Sanjeev ji and you, Sriram ji, on the stage for the panel discussion.
Okay, so congratulations on getting your book published. Being an aspiring author, unpublished author, I know the fear and trepidation that we feel in putting our words out to public. So congratulations. And how did it feel when you saw your book in your hands first time?
Thank you. Yeah, it felt special because unlike I've already authored 2 more books earlier on different subjects, but this took 5 years for me to write. There's a reason why it took 5 years. One is what I mentioned. There was literally nothing available in terms of literature for me to sort of work on. Next is the text itself. It's in dense Sanskritam, so you had to learn Sanskritam as a language and then work with Sanskritam scholars to sort of iterate, ideate with them, and then bring subject matter expertise to the subject, in this case, economics and finance. And then how do you sort of make it relevant to a young audience like this? So I think in that sense, it involved a wide range of skill sets. And the book should also be appealing to a common reader, not to Sanjeev Kumar, for example, because an academic audience is, well, most of my friends are academics, but my personal view is that unless it reaches the common audience, the impact of the idea will be minimal. So the packaging had to be done in a way where both the academics, the experts, and the common people sort of like the book. So in that sense, I think it was quite special, but there's a lot of work behind the book, and I'm glad my publishers sort of gave me the freedom to do what I wanted. And it's been doing very well. It's already in its second run. Sold more than 3,000, 4,000 copies already. So I think there's a lot of appetite among young people in today's India for such content. I think complex content is the king nowadays.
So why do you think that's the case, that we, especially in Indian economists, they do not focus on Kautilya? So as you were saying earlier, that if you don't know the path that you have taken to get where you are, it's very hard to chart the path forward. So why did not occur to Indian authors, economists earlier, to go into different aspects of Kautilya? Or what we have missed?
I think there's a variety of reasons, right? I think often economists are so, we are so preoccupied with the idea of quantitative, tools and techniques, econometrics and things like that. Mm-hmm. We tend to take it as gospel truth. But unfortunately, I think the world beyond is a far more complex enterprise, especially in a country like India, where there are complex communities, complex societies, complex interactions, which are central to how the economy is functioning. So I'll give you an example. The Reserve Bank of India came up with the sovereign gold scheme. Basically, any individual could go and invest your gold with the Reserve Bank of India, And after maturity, say 2-3 years, you get back with the premium on the gold, with a new bunch of gold. The scheme wasn't successful in the first run. The single most important reason was that Indian women wanted the same gold that they deposited back to them, meaning the same gold, because there was a cultural value that they attribute to the metal. As economists, we are used to saying it's not a productive asset. There's no sort of magic around it. But the way society consumes, but the way society functions is very different. And I think that's far more important in a society such as ours. Western civilizations don't really have this complex dynamic of the culture sort of playing an important role in the economy. I think in India we do. And I think a sort of an understanding of the past could help us figure out how some of the thinkers of the past have dealt with this. I think it's a pity that, no one has really gone into the past. I think it's a must. Other civilizations have done it. I mean, the Chinese do a lot of research on ancient China's history, economic history. Their current policies, some of them, are reflective of that ancient history. Same thing with Japan. In fact, the Japanese even have an economic history subunit within the Ministry of Finance.
Oh, wow, I did not know that.
This is what I was told by my friend who's working there, and that they do sort of rigorous, try to do as much rigorous research as possible and look at other ways of defining the economy. So I think it's a pity that it's not being done, and I think more needs to be done.
So we are hoping that the students in audience will get motivated to understand our past and build a framework that will help them understand how to move forward. I tell them in the classes that I'm teaching that India is probably the most complex society on the face of earth. So that itself should get them excited about digging deeper into India. So I wanted to show you some, for the purpose of audience, some clips from Upanishad Ganga.
कहिए।
आचार्य, आज्ञा हो तो मैं एक प्रस्ताव रखना चाहता हूं।
प्रस्ताव व्यक्तिगत हित में है या सार्वजनिक हित में?
मैं समझा नहीं आचार्य।
काम निजी है या सार्वजनिक?
स्वार्थ तो निजी होता है आचार्य।
तुम्हारे निजी स्वार्थ के लिए प्रजा की ओर से दिए जाने वाले तेल को मैं व्यर्थ नहीं जला सकता। कहो, मैं अंधेरे में भी तुम्हारी बात सुन सकता हूं।
क्षमा करें आचार्य, मैं दिन के उजाले में आऊंगा।
श्रेष्ठी सुदत्त, धर्म, अर्थ, काम में से किसी एक का भी अधिक सेवन अनर्थ करता है। पाया गया
शायद नहीं।
हाँ या नहीं?
अर्जन करना चाहिए।
नहीं धान्य समूह अयम अर्थ।
अन्न से बढ़कर दूसरा धन नहीं।
न क्षुधा समः शत्रु।
भूख से बढ़कर दूसरा शत्रु नहीं।
प्रणाम आचार्य।
सम्राट, क्या मगध विजय के पहले तुम्हारी सेना नंदीग्राम के पास ठहरी थी?
हाँ आचार्य।
क्या तुम्हारी सेना ने ग्रामवासियों से अन्न लिया था?
हाँ आचार्य।
क्या उसका मूल्य चुकाया गया?
शायद नहीं।
हाँ या नहीं?
नहीं आचार्य।
क्या समझकर तुमने वो अन्न ग्रहण किया? दान या दक्षिणा?
मैं समझा नहीं आचार्य।
शारंगराव, सम्राट को दान और दक्षिणा का अर्थ समझाओ।
सम्राट, दान वह मूल्य है जो सामाजिक कर्तव्य के रूप में दिया जाता है, और दक्षिणा वह मूल्य है जो किसी सेवा के बदले में दी जाती है।
तुमने क्या लिया? दान या दक्षिणा?
क्षमा आचार्य, मैं उस अन्न का मूल्य चुका दूंगा।
ध्यान रहे चंद्रगुप्त, हर वस्तु का मूल्य है।
Well, you think Chanakya understood the idea of opportunity cost. This is just shockingly profound take 2,500 years ago.
In fact, that's a very interesting video, and I think that clearly highlights the point that I'm talking about. These type of ideas which are there for a common audience, experts such as Sanjeev ji need to sort of look into it through their expertise, in this case economics and finance, and draw parallels and frameworks for the same. In fact, in Balbir ji's book, Balbir Sihag, whom I mentioned, we were just discussing this just before our discussion, that he's a PhD from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and one of his advisors, I think, was Paul Samuelson. And when they were discussing on the idea of opportunity cost, he actually mentioned about Kautilya to him. And that's where sort of his interest in the subject expanded. So, Kautilya definitely mentions about opportunity cost, the idea of opportunity cost in the text. The idea of value, the idea of wealth, the idea of looking at the entire way of life as an economic ecosystem, not as some isolated sort of entity. I think that's why we need to give credit to Kautilya, because we're talking about sustainable growth today when climate change is an issue. 30, 40 years back, the idea of sustainable growth wasn't given the premium that's given today. But Kautilya understood the holistic, holistic and comprehensive feel of the economy much before others. So this is a very, very good illustration of this.
So I want to complete that story about Sihag. So when Sihag went to Paul Samuelson, who is a Nobel laureate, first Nobel laureate in economics, and he told him about Kautilya, the first question that Samuelson asked, is there discussion of opportunity cost in the book? And Sihag did not know that, so he went back to Kautilya's book, and he found there was an umpteen discussion of opportunity cost. So just for the students in the audience, the idea of this, so opportunity cost is an example of counterfactual thinking. So that is at the core of causal understanding, how to build causal understanding of the world, that what kind of world in which you are living. So it's quite, for me, it was just shocking that Kautilya had these perspective in mind. So the question is, like, what allowed Kautilya to have these perspective? What is it about Indian thought process that allowed him to take the jump that, so idea opportunity cost became very, very critical through the this saying by Milton Friedman that there's no free lunch. So long back, what kind of knowledge system allowed Kautilya? If you can just make some conjecture. I know it's a difficult question, but...
Yeah, see, at the end of the day, he was a very practical political economist. He was an advisor to the king. So he wanted political dominance as, sort of the supreme. And he believed that economic prosperity was central to that. And he believed in ideas that were practically getting implemented. So that's where the idea of dharma comes into play. Because he saw the dharmic way of life as something that was there already for him to see. And he was able to sort of draw linkages with how people made consumer choices. Because all these consumer behavioral choices eventually map up to what we call the macroeconomy. In the case of Bharat, he felt that there was a strong, compelling need for people to make these choices based on the way of life that they had. So he personally felt that, unless you understood this, you're not going to have economic prosperity. And that was very important for him to achieve political dominance. So I would call him a saint. I would call him a very practical, pragmatic political economist who understood a lot of these behavioral choices which he was seeing around were made not because policy was thrust on people, rather the other way around. People had a way of life, and policy had to be sort of adjusted to maximize outcomes based on the way of life. So I think that's where the crux is of Kautilya's approach to,
So you are terming the Kautilyan approach to what you call dharmic capitalism. So so there is a certain element of contradiction I see, like in bringing dharma and capitalism together. It's like putting like horses, what you call putting it like it feels like a tiger dressing up like a horse. So would you elaborate on that? How do you come in terms with that contradiction?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's something which I sort of mentally debated myself. But see, I had to sort of contextualize this for the young audience who are so attuned to the idea of capitalism mentally that I had to sort of bring it in that mold. Ideally speaking, I would have probably taken out the idea of capitalism and probably mentioned as dharmonomics or something like that. But given the importance of contextualizing his thinking and to make it easier for the common reader to sort of relate to, I sort of ventured onto this. Again, capitalism has evolved significantly over the last 100, 150 years. What we define today as capitalism is very different to what was, say, even 20, 30 years ago. So I think that's a recent construct. It's an evolving construct. And in all fairness, the dharmic model which Kautilya had should be an individual entity by itself, something like dharmonomics. But given my need to sort of help people understand it better, I sort of framed it that way. So
when I think about how we can make a dharma central concern of the economic system. I always ask my students one question, that what is it by knowing which you become that? Or then I kind of try to quantify that by asking this question, how much money do I need to pay you to turn you into a robot? So that is to bring this idea that in India they understood something that lies beyond language as the core of our being. So how you think we can bring that kind of concern? So one way, you have emphasized quite a lot in the book about how cognizant Kautilya was about role of taxes and subsidies in the functioning of economy. So that's the internalization of externalities angle. So he had a very deep understanding of that. So is that the angle that you want to take to bring dharma into the economic system, to make it a dharmic capitalism?
This is precisely the question which I wanted academics such as yours to sort of think and explore. Because this has never been discussed in public policy circles. There are multiple ways to do this in my view. One is doing it at the margin level. So let's take Swachh Bharat for example. From my personal experience in my travels and all these things, I found Swachh Bharat to be far more effective in rural areas than urban areas. But if you look at really the idea of Swachh Bharat, it's basically, we're all clean in our houses, most of us, 99% of us, are very, very clean in our, puja room, in our houses. We don't bring that sort of dharmic instinct to the outside. What Swachh Bharat tries to do is, through the, grandeur and the push of a very popular leader, is to scale this dharmic instinct into a public enterprise. So take it from the internal to the external, right? So when you're doing that, what you're basically doing is you're taking the way of life which you have internally and allowing it to be part of public policy. So the effectiveness of public policy is a natural construct. I'm not thrusting public policy onto you. Whereas you are taking your way of life and then taking it outside. So no matter what happens, you would still be doing this because you're convinced by the internal mechanisms that you're doing. So at the margin, how do you make policy more effective? If it's 80% effective, how do you bring it to the 90-95% level? I think that's where understanding these factors, conceptualizing could help. Another is, as economists, we're obsessed with data. So if you can have a sustainability index, why can't we have a dharmic coefficient index for each state, for example? Right? So I've defined in this book dharma by ethics, responsibilities, and say communal harmony or international harmony. Eventually say we come to a consensus on how dharma is defined. Create an index which sort of gives you parameters, quantifiable parameters for each of these components. And then for each state or each region, you have something like a sustainability index. And if you can develop a time series which is strong enough, say over a period of 5-10 years, then it's a policy asset. So I think that's how we need to think about this. Rather than just sort of negating it, slighting it, and then, reducing the value of it, I think we need to see how we can either get a quantifiable mechanism like this or work on the margins to make current policy more effective. So these are two approaches which I would see to sort of mainstream this a bit more.
That's a very nice idea to think about this dharmic index for each state. Because the idea is also to help our future generation and next generation to have a very good understanding of this different ontological foundation of the way we conceptualize individual in the bigger scheme of things. That's very different than Western take.
Yeah, why should we be constrained by the parameters of sustainability that the West is showing us?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? The Japanese have the Kanban theory, okay? The Japanese have quality systems all named after indigenous Japanese qualities. So why do we need to constrain ourselves to a norm that has been established in just 100, 200 years? Whereas we have a much longer, richer, historical, impetus. It is indeed valid that more research needs to go, but that's not an excuse for not thinking on these lines.
So I was at local university recently, not Rishu, some other university, and I asked few econ undergraduate students if they had heard about Kautilya. They told me they are taught a course on history of economic thoughts called Smith to Sen, and Kautilya was never mentioned. So I see that your book is set to change that. But what are the impediments that you see going forward in terms of adoption of these historical narrative? Because for some reason, I think in the way economics developed in the West, they became very history agnostic because of the violence that was as a tool that was used to develop their economies. But in the case of India, I think bringing history can enrich our understanding of economic system far more than it can do for other societies.
Definitely. Speaking of Smith, right, I don't compare him too much in this book because that's a book by itself. Balbirji does a lot. If you look at what Smith's Wealth of Nations is, and if you look at Chanakya's Kautilya's Arthashastra, you barely would find any, if you find Kautilya to be archaic, then Smith is equally archaic. He just gives a set of ideas which people have picked up and used these ideas for a variety of reasons. Full credit to Smith. I'm not denying that. But what I'm trying to say is that Kautilya's ideas are far more practical and they're far more policy driven through that lens. So I think you're right. Western scholars, because of their background and things like that, didn't really put too much value. I think there's a very strong case for us to look at it. Because if we don't bring it to the rest of the world, who else is going to do? And I think that's where these institutions play a role. Because we need to do it with a level of analytical rigor that people, don't question you on the quality of your work. They might question you on
Ideology.
Yeah, they might question you on different thinkers. If they bring a Chinese thinker or a Greek thinker or whatever it is, they might have competing narratives. That is part of the course in research. But I think the focus really is we need to bring quality research. I think that's where institutes like Rishi would play a very important role, in my view.
True. So, thinking about Smith, there is a recently book I found, Gloria Loom. She has written a book on America's Smith and how Adam Smith was politicized in America in order to support the market as a driving institution. While if you look into the history of the West, the state played a very, very critical role in its development. So,
See, there are also other fallacies of Kautilya which I also take on, subtly in the book, but I think it's important. One is this issue of socialist state, which people keep parroting about it without much evidence. Kautilya is a very detailed state, but it's not a socialist state. A socialist state. So, for example, say me and Sanjeev are trading goods, spices, okay? A socialist state would, besides the regulations that you have, would micromanage how much quantity of trade both of us are doing. Kautilya never does that. He tells you these are the rules and regulations. These are strong rules and regulations. You violate the rule, punishment is severe. But when it comes to individual transactions, ease of business, all these things is up to individual businesses and people to do. So I think that's where I sort of disagree with other people saying, who just ridicule Kautilya saying it's a socialist state, which is not the case. He is a very detailed state, no doubt. But the state doesn't intervene on microeconomic activity at any level. The same thing with the comparison with Machiavelli. Machiavelli's prince is about protecting the kingdom. Kautilya brilliantly states that the welfare of the people is most important. there's a very good quote. Praja sukhe sukham rajnah, prajanam tu preyamitam. Nat preyamitam rajnah, prajanam tu preyamitam. He says that the welfare of the people is the most important thing. The happiness and the welfare of the people are not taken into account. He says if the king or the queen can be replaced, and his kith and kin can be replaced. I think more and more research into Kautilya will bring out some of these nuances and their differences.
So why do you think Kautilya felt that the freedom that we need to give to citizens is sacrosanct? I see a huge dharmic element there with all these Mahavakyas exhorting us to see divinity in others being the reason why he could think about providing freedom the way in the West now they are coming in terms with. So do you agree with that observation that it's something about the dharmic ways of thinking or Indian ways of thinking that allowed him to have that kind of balanced role of a state in the functioning of the economy?
Of course, I'll probably give another perspective. It could also be that, see, he understood that for political success, the large parts of the population needs to be satisfied, which means the real poor. So their welfare needs to be taken. Welfare without freedom, in his view, was not a win-win situation. Mm-hmm. So there is also the role of dharma. So he believed that unless people are free to do what they have to do, they wouldn't be satisfied. That's something he came to a conclusion in his treatise. Another important point is, throughout the Arthashastra, he's context agnostic. He doesn't talk about the Mauryan Empire. He doesn't talk about religion. I mean, of course, he talks about dharma, and dharma is based on Sanatana Dharma and the contours of it. So he wanted to sort of set a template for governance based on these principles, which are rational, analytical, and practical. So I think that's where his USP is, because he's a very, very practical political economist.
Sometimes when I think about ancient India, I wonder, what was there in the air at that time that it was producing intellectuals like Kautilya or many others, who had such a deep understanding of the laws governing our lives. So do you think Sanskrit played a critical role in helping them understand the way world is?
Central role, I would say. I think one of our biggest pities, for our generation, the last 200, 300 years, is the deterioration of Sanskritam as a language. I wouldn't even call it a language. It's a Deva Bhasha. It's more of an understanding of society, people, and it's a multidimensional nature of that language. And I think it's very, very important to understand that. Any of our scriptures, if you need to have a holistic understanding, we need to understand Sanskritam. That's why I would urge Shobhitji and others to have an elective for students in Sanskritam, in public policy.
So we have a minor in Sanskrit here.
So that would be really useful. Because I had to relearn Sanskritam again for this book. I had already done a diploma earlier, and I'm still learning so many things working with scholars. So I think any sort of ancient understanding of India, Bharat, I think requires some level of Sanskrit. So that is definitely sort of a link, I would say, as you mentioned.
Okay, so on Living Economist, can you think of any recent book that can come close to becoming that classic that Arthashastra became? If not, why not?
Not really, because often most of the current books are all about the contemporary, and their understanding of history is about 100 to 200 years. So I wouldn't really be fascinated by something unless something comes 5,000 years ago. But the problem is most of the books that come 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago are either too simplified or don't have the academic rigor. That's where I hope more books come along these lines, which make people sit up and think. So, yeah, I don't really have suggestions off the back of my hand now.
So I would like to ask the audience, like, how many of you know how Kautilya died? How Kautilya died? Yeah, Anushika?
So, Chanakya died because his enemies planned, the whole, I would say, I'm not getting the word, they planned how to, criticize him in front of the whole audience, the whole, ministry. But when he was not able to come to the ministry, they ended up getting him into a solitude place, solace place, and they planned his murder. Because Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka, was with allies of Chanakya. So the one who were the enemies of King Ashoka, they planned the murder of Kautilya as well.
Okay, so there are many stories about that, but one that I'm aware of is Kautilya, I think it was Ajatasattu who had a doubt in his mind about Kautilya's loyalty. So he just walked to a heap of cow dung, and meditated himself to death. So, so why I'm bringing it in this discussion is because the kind of understanding that Indian intellectuals, saints, rishis had about who they are played a big role in their understanding of the way world is. And how we can rejuvenate that without rejuvenating Sanskrit, I don't know. So in that count, I asked you about that question. So I have a few more, let me see. Sanskrit rule. Then, since I'm leading Rashtram School of Public Leadership, I would like you to talk about some leadership lessons from Kautilya for us.
I think the single biggest leadership lesson from Kautilya is to listen to the common man. Often as public policy professionals, more so intellectuals, we tend to think that we know everything. Sitting in these cities and academic institutions. But I think Kautilya is very humble to understand that the pulse of the common man is central to policy making. So he would do that. For example, a lot of the governance was decentralized in Kautilya's time. For example, there were statistic offices who picked up data on price points. Members, individual people would go to houses to understand price points at the panchayat and village level. Besides, the temple is a central sort of activity pillar. A lot of these mechanisms were decentralized so that they can pick up all these data points, and then they would go to the central sort of authority for them to make up their mind. Obviously, there's a lag compared to today in terms of technology and all these things. But at a conceptual level, he sort of understood that unless he had a sense of common people's preferences and choices, he as an advisor won't be able to connect the dots and do what is important. Another idea is the concept of minimum wage. So he introduced this concept of flexible minimum wage. We in the US, for example, $15 minimum wage is talked about politically a lot. $15 at 3% inflation is very different from $15 at 8% inflation, because your real rates are lower. Mm-hmm. So Kautilya sort of understood this much earlier. He felt that the minimum wage needs to be revised every 2-3 years, depending on other circumstances. And different people below the poverty line had different sort of minimum wage levels. So he saw the need for flexibility in policy in these type of instances. Another instance is labor contracts. He believed that even the common daily wage laborer needs to have a labor contract with the employee. So the employee needs to be transparent on how many hours he or she is working, and they need to define the work for them. So there is some level of protection for the common person. So the idea of labor contracts, again, it's there in the chapter where he talks about this. So in every sphere of economic policy, Kautilya has some of these ideas which are still relevant today. I think that's where the big learning is for us, in my view. So these are some examples which sort of came to my head right away.
So one idea that I have been mesmerized by is how well in ancient India they had understood the idea of humility, vinamrata. So why do you think, like even Chanakya talks about vinamrata being one of the key trait that one needs to develop? So I know, like, this is not area of a research, but I want you to have some conjecture about why he was so ready to listen to common.
He is, in the first chapter of the book, I talk about how Kautilya acknowledges a lot of his ideas were taken from a prior past, from the Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and all these places. He's very humble enough to accept that. He disagrees with Brihaspati, he disagrees with Sukracharya, agrees in some cases with all of them. So, and he also says he's not perfect. Even I say that. He's not God, for example. So, he accepts his infallibility. He also accepts that there are situations where different things could be, changed. So, in that sense, I think ancient society in general was like that. The various rishis always understood that, they are sort of a small pawn in the bigger, enterprise. And that's how their philosophies, thinking, were all sort of an agglomeration of this bigger thinking. And Kautilya is no exception. You're right, he's very humble, not just for the people, but for acknowledgement of a lot of his ideas. And also how some of these ideas came from people before him. Which for a scholar is, even those times, giving credit was part of our Swadharma. So I think, that is integral.
So this reminds me of a conversation I had in the US with few economists, because Adam Smith had this book, Theory of Moral Sentiment, before he wrote The Wealth of Nation. And there he's talking about impartial spectator. So I asked a few economists that I met at Yale that if they know the precedence of that idea. And in my research, I'm finding it goes all the way to Ashtavakra Gita, where all the time this discussion about Sakshi, witness, is there, So I was quite impressed. I did not know that Kautilya acknowledged all the past writers when he's writing about Arthashastra. If Adam Smith would have done that, probably West would have benefited quite a lot, because then they would have delved into Upanishad and Vedas with far more sincerity than they have done in past.
I'd say, the often impression of a lot of our Vedic scriptures and texts is that it's primarily a spiritual, sort of, for you to have a spiritual path of salvation, moksha. These are probably avenues for you to do that. But there was an undercurrent of conventional life when all these scriptures were there. I think the key is really to understand some of these contours. One last point which I sort of missed earlier was that my interest towards this came also because I was working on Angus Madison's data set.
Yeah, you have mentioned that.
So Angus Madison produced a data set for 1,000 years of economic growth from 0 CE onwards, where India and China were the top two countries till about 17th century. My theory, intuitive theory, was that there had to be some functioning framework to facilitate this. Given that there are anecdotes by Greek travelers, Chinese travelers, a wide range of other travelers, who say how prosperous Bharat was. And there had to be, it's not some random event. I don't know how many people have gone to the Bradishwara temple in Tamil Nadu. It is an engineering marvel.
Yeah.
Even today, it's very difficult to build a temple of such, engineering complexity. You mean to say that these ancient people didn't understand economics 101? So, I think that's the line of thinking. We have to give the benefit of the doubt, given these other anecdotes everywhere else, of how people sort of conceptualized and how these civilizations were living. In fact, my subsequent book is also.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question and last question. Sure. Is tell us about your next project. You have spent 5 years thinking about Kautilya, so I'm sure this is not going to be the last book on Kautilya for you.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't take me another 5 years, but the next project is, again, now that this book is doing really well, I think within 3-4 months it's already sold 3,000, 4,000 copies. So it's en route to a bestseller. There is so much interest among the young on such content. And it's to their credit. I'm a non-celebrity author. If my good friend Sai Deepak was here, then I can understand. Though he doesn't accept that. But anyways, so. But what I'm trying to say is there's a huge appetite among the young, 18 to 25, 26, that I see in my book tours, of interest, fascination. There are people who've read this book twice. Can you imagine? And they're asking such detailed questions to me. So there is an enormous appetite. So this next book sort of takes this idea of dharmic capitalism and then looks at more common era kingdoms. And looks at how there's first, if there is a connect. Second, how is this connect sort of evolved in those civilizations? It could change. In some areas they might not, like a strong state. Some areas they might be a slightly weaker state. I don't know. So the point really is to sort of understand how the principle of Kautilya evolved in some of these common era kingdoms. There are a lot of these inscriptions of the Arthashastra in the Chola empires, in the Vijayanagar Empire, in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So I sort of try to explore some of these things. Hopefully, because my main goal is to show the continuum of what I'm seeing, so that researchers understand this is just not a one-off phenomenon. And I hope, the next stage would be, once we establish this with subsequent works, then you're putting a qualitative time series to these concepts, and then take it forward. How do you take it forward will be the next question.
And that counters the many people, when you talk about Kautilya, they say that maybe it's a figment of some creative writer's imagination. So that your research will be able to counter that kind of objection.
Definitely. And figment or not, the text is available. The thing is, another point which again I want to mention, there's often a question, because when you indulge in this type of research, you're often thrown skepticism is the number one thing that comes from people. There's the backstory to how the Arthashastra was actually set up, what this was discovered. A lot of people know that Shyama Sastri produced the 1914 scripture. So the Arthashastra was discovered for the first time after 1,000 years in Bharat. Everything else was just anecdotal. But there's a backstory to that which I heard. There's a Vedic Pandit from Tanjavur who discovered the actual manuscript, the palm leaves. He went all the way from Tanjavur to Mysore, which is across 2 states now, and because the Mysore Oriental Library was one of the top libraries at that time during the British era, and gave it to a person who was a librarian, and that happened to be Shyama Sastri. So imagine if this Tanjavur Pandit had all the reasons. He had all the reasons not to do this. The British was ruling India. He had no financial gain out of this. There is no one would have even spoken about this. But there was probably a dharmic impulse that he felt that he was part of a bigger picture that had to be, part of this. So that's why I think, so what I'm trying to say is there'll be a lot of naysayers. I think it's important for us to sort of look beyond this and focus on, how we can do quality research on such subjects.
So congratulations again on the book.
Thank you.
And may this book launches hundreds and thousands of other books on Kautilya.
Thank you. And now that Shobit is here, I want to also appreciate the work that he and Rishi Hood are doing. Because it's no joke to do this. I know, there's a lot of work involved. But one of the reasons why I feel that, we try to have this event in Delhi, and I feel it's a blessing that we had it here, is because I think these institutes need to be nurtured. And the philosophy behind it, getting, seasoned academics like yourself to be part of this, I think it's a very, very important asset. We might not appreciate it today. I'm pretty sure 15, 20 years down the line, this should be a flagship institution for public policy and other things in the country.
And we will have a campus in America.
Or probably you might have a campus here itself.
No. We will also have a campus in America.
Sure, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sirs, for this wonderful discussion. And I would especially like to thank Sriram ji for coming today and sharing your profound and deep knowledge on the subject with us. And we all saw that you were not really well. And it is also a lesson for all of us that even when we are not at our best, we shall give our best. And I think our students will benefit not just from reading this book, but also by the way you conduct yourself and the way you have come here. And I would like to invite Shobit ji to speak to us and address us.
No, I'll just take 2 minutes. So Sriram has been chasing me since I was in the US. We had come for a tour at University of Maryland, he said. So I can see that the kind of effort that has gone into the book and the willingness to speak to the next generation or the young people and talking about this. The story you talked about, the Pandit, the Vedic Pandit from Tanjavur all the way to Mysore, in that sense is doing it for us. Because otherwise these things get lost, right? That is how tradition has continued. How many books do you know that are 2000 plus years old and are still relevant? From the Western literature, you will not be able to possibly have any names also, right? It has been kept alive only because of people dedicated like Sriram who have delved into them, read them, contemporized them, passed it on. You will read it, you will contemporize. So that is how these books have stayed relevant for a very long time. I think that is the whole spirit that we should all imbibe. That this knowledge is timeless, it can always adapt itself for changing times. And at each generation, we will need champions like this who will take it up and further it. That is what is civilization, finally, right? Sabhyata, something that is continuously flowing and alive, is civilization. And it can only be done if you have thought leaders and champions like Sriram who are doing this. Luckily, finally you made it here. But it's our role as an institution to imbibe this and then spread it to many more people. That is a responsibility that all of us should take. Not just this book, but all the knowledge heritage that we have. Can we just read one text in our time here at Rishi Hood and champion it for the rest of our lives? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And I would request.
Sorry, just one thing. Some of you asked where you can get the book. It's available on Amazon. So you can just, I'll try to send the link of the book to to Sanjeev and Shobit. What I would request is, please read the book and review it, because unless young people, policymakers review it, I'm not saying it should be a positive review, but I'm saying there should be a review, and there should be sort of, either in public platforms or on Amazon or whatever it is, so that there's a constant engagement. And that is something I would really appreciate. So I really thank everyone for your support. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I would request all our participants to book their copies as soon as possible. And finally, I will thank you again, sir, for coming here. I would thank Sanjeev ji for moderating this session in such a graceful manner. Shobhi ji for arranging this talk so that our students can benefit and learn some economics mixed with dharmic concepts. Our professors, Kavita ji, Chitra ji, Bhaskar sir, for Malviya ji for being here, and all our participants, students for being such a nice audience, and finally our technical team, Saurabh, Ajay Bhaiya, and Harish ji for managing everything so well. Thank you very much, and we will now close with a minute of silence.